Thanks everybody for joining us for our lunchtime webinar, our joint IACES UACES seminar, as part of an ongoing series of seminars that the two European Studies Associations in the UK and Ireland have been co-organising over the past 2 years, exploring issues in the UK, Ireland and the EU in a time of crisis. My name is Jonathan Evershed. I'm the current president of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies of IACES. I am really delighted to welcome our panelists to this discussion about the contemporary politics of gender and sexuality in Ireland, the UK and Europe. This seminar is an important expression of our two associations' commitment to being allies and to being proactive forces in the stamping out of misogyny, homophobia and transphobia. And we want to make those commitments and flag those commitments at the outset of this lecture. We're really looking forward to this really important, really timely, and no doubt very wide-ranging discussion. I will now very happily yield the floor to the chair of today's session, Mary McAuliffe, my colleague, Dr. Mary McAuliffe at UCD, who is a historian lecturer and director of gender studies at UCD, specializing in Irish women's and gender histories, trauma histories of gendered and sexual violence in Ireland, and the history of sexuality in Ireland. There really is no better person to be chairing today's discussion. And I will briefly pop back into the to your screen, pop back onto your screens at the end of today's session. But for now, I'm looking forward to sitting back, to listening, to thinking critically with this fabulous group of scholars and activists that have agreed to participate in today's event. So thank you all, and over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm very delighted to be here with you all today on this webinar on the politics of gender and sexuality across Ireland, the UK and Europe. And in the introduction, you mentioned I was a historian of trauma, war violence against women, and the histories of sexualities. And obviously, that is in the past 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. However, wearing my other hat as a feminist and a feminist activist and director of gender studies in UCD, I am very aware of our contemporary politics and the politics of risk and crises we're going through. I suppose in many ways a backlash against the gains of feminism, of LGBT activists, of race activists, ethnic minorities. And in this week, I suppose, if we look across the wide Atlantic Ocean to America and see what happened with Roe v. Wade, and indeed it was not the only decision handed down by the US Supreme Court this week that negatively and adversely impacts on populations of color, on LGBT people, on indigenous populations, and on the climate emergency. But specifically that this week was just such a body blow in many ways to what we have as activists and academics been both fighting for and indeed writing about and thinking about over the last number of decades. So this will be a very interesting discussion. We are concentrating, coming back across the Atlantic Ocean on Ireland, the UK and Europe, but I think we have to see it in its global context as well, because all of these things in our global world are so interrelated. So be that as it may, I shall briefly introduce each of our speakers, and then each of them will give a 5 to 7 minute statement, and then we will do a discussion between us all, and then we will throw the floor open to questions from the attendees if you would use the question and answer section, and I will put those questions to our very esteemed panel. So what I'll do is introduce everybody, and then we will get started on the heart of this matter. So firstly, in no particular order, Peter Dunn is Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Bristol and is an expert in the field of gender, sexuality and the law in the UK and Europe. Tony Halstrop is Professor of International Politics at the University of Stirling, a teacher and researcher with expertise on the European Union's external relations. She's a frequent speaker and media commentator on issues related to gender, feminism, and the persistence of coloniality in global politics. Roberta Garina, I hope I pronounced that properly, is a professor in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol and an expert on EU gender politics and policies. Koen Slootmakers is a senior lecturer in international politics at the Department of International Politics at City, University of London. He has a multidisciplinary background and combines insights from sociology and political science in his work, and he focuses on gender and sexuality politics in Europe. And Fiachra O'Sullivan is a lecturer in social work at UCC, University College Cork. He researches on gender and sexualities, LGBT+ matters, social services and welfare practice, child sex abuse, child protection and welfare, and professional practice. He is treasurer of the UCC LGBT+ staff network. So I believe that because you may have to vacate the room before the end of the webinar, Koen, and you want to go first, and Roberta, yeah.
Hi, Mary. Thank you very much. I'll go first. So we'll get started. First of all, thank you to IACES and UACES for inviting us to this workshop today to tackle some really important issues. And thank you, Mary, also for framing it in terms of the challenges and the kind of Groundhog Day that we are kind of facing, and how sexual health and reproductive rights are coming back to the kind of frame and driving the kind of discussions. This is on the background, we have an image that was used by one of the panelists at CES earlier today, and I think it's really important that we use this as a way to think about it. So the way that what I'm going to say is that it's a little bit about the EU as a gender equality actor and the impact of gender equality policies have had or not had on advancing a progressive gender practice across member states, the challenges that we're facing in relations to the impact of de-democratization and why we need to look at gender equality and the challenge to gender equality as a weather vane for de-democratization across Europe. So many of us have long said that, or have done research looking at whether the European Union, as a gender equality actor, walks the walk beyond just talking the talk. So whether the values that they seek or aspire to embed within their everyday actions, stemming from the founding treaties, are actually operationalized in a way that is inclusive. And what we're finding is that there is a real disjuncture between the values that they claim to be aspiring towards and the actions that they take. Or is a question that we also need to pose. Is the way that equality was framed within the founding treaties leading to path dependence and limiting the kind of gender equality actor at the EU? So if we look at the founding treaties, the root of gender equality within the European Union is in the principle of equal pay for equal work between men and women. The principle itself was not even about work of equal value. It was literally about equal work. So what we're seeing in that, it's a framing of gender equality, that relates to access to the labor market and the public sphere based on male standards. but also the interpretation of gender and gender equality along a binary. So the focus is on providing women with access to the public sphere and employment rights. So this limits our understanding of gender equality within the gender acquis in fairly significant ways. First of all, it does not challenge male norms, and certainly does not challenge the male norm of worker, especially in relation to the equal pay for equal work. I know that obviously the frame has been extended through subsequent legislation, but I think it is important to understand those roots in themselves. Fast forward 70 years, and what we're seeing now in the context of gender equality politics at the European level is a real push to erase gender as a frame from policies and policy discussions in favor of women's rights and equality between women and men. This is a direct result of the European Union framing and strategic use of gender and women as synonymous terms in relations to the work that they're doing, and therefore limits the scope of the policies themselves. It also offers an opportunity to gender critical actors to challenge gender to challenge any kind of legislation or policies that seek to shift gender equality, seek to treat gender equality not just as an issue of access, but as an issue of structures that is embedded with power, that also relates to identities, and that relates to how we relate to each other. So it is about limiting our understanding of gender to one that is sex-driven or based on sex-based rights, rather than one that understands the relational nature of the power structures that are embedded within practices around gender, race, sexuality, class, disability, and so on. So in that regard, despite the shift by the European Commission to include, at a very superficial level, mentions to issues such as intersectionality and race, what we see is a very limited understanding of those issues. And our framing and understanding of gender equality within the treaties further compounds that. So why reproductive rights are important? Because what we're seeing is a challenge to democratic governance, legitimacy, and accountability. And in this regard, what we're starting to see, both coming from the Atlantic, across the Atlantic, but also coming from within member states themselves, is a push to challenge what are perceived to be established norms around sexual health and reproductive rights. And in so doing, what we really need to treat is these issues around gender, sexuality, reproductive rights as indicators of de-democratization, because what they're seeking to do is limit access to participation and engagement and democracy and governance for groups that are traditionally seen as minoritized or marginal. So in this regard, I think there is a real trend at the moment to challenge the progress that was seen to be made. That is both within the institutions, but also at the national and subnational level. What I would encourage us to think about is how this is not just happening in a vacuum, but it is the byproduct of the values and the norms and legal principles that we establish within the foundations of this project. And in so doing, perhaps really think about how do we extend them and how do we codify them so to actually protect and promote the rights, both of individuals and groups within those minoritized groups. And finally, and I think this is really the perhaps most important point, is that in this kind of context, it helps to shift from a framing that juxtaposes the rights of individuals to those of groups to actually see them as mutually reinforcing. and actually thinking about social justice and inclusion as a more holistic, in a more holistic way, so that the rights of different groups are not pitted against each other. I think I'll leave it at that, Mary, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, and lots to think about there. But I will save my questions till the end. But yes, thank you very much. That was very interesting. So, Koen, I believe you're next.
Yeah, shall I pick up? I feel like might rehearse some of what, or repeat what Roberta said in different ways. I think when I think about EU politics around sexuality and LGBT rights, I like to think a bit about, okay, where we are, how do we talk about where we are, and then the kind of consequences of all of that. I think currently we're in a juxtaposition between the European Union as an institution promoting itself as being exceptionally good at protecting LGBT rights. There is a narrative in how it's producing its documents towards the outside world as we are a beacon of progress. And we are trying to then export that as we were elsewhere, particularly in the candidate countries, but it's part and parcel of most of its work in external action service as well, given that they're now binding guidelines that every delegation must do LGBTI work in their work. But what also, I think that at the same time what is happening, we see massive contestation around these rights across the continent. And I say across the continent, across the European Union, because even though we'd like to talk about it as an Eastern European problem, it's definitely not. It's happening in every single country. And one of the things that frustrates me a lot when we talk about LGBT rights within the EU is that this East-West divide is being naturalized, it's being taken for granted, it's being reinforced, it's being made to be almost essentializing Eastern Europe as being forever and always behind, backwards, and can only try to catch up, but actually it will fail because of its past, whether it's a Soviet past or like socialist past or whatever, which I think is a very dangerous narrative because it's creating a kind of disjuncture between utopias, queer utopias within Europe, where the Western Europe is seen as to be exceptionally amazing and like the leaders of everything, and there can't be any homophobia anymore, versus some dystopias where everything is really bad and it's violent, you can't live and you can't be queer in these spaces, and then taking away any like agency of queer people within these places. And I think this is very problematic. And one of the reasons why this happens is because we have an excessive fetish with the law. We putting progress on the, sorry, Peter, I know, I don't want to undermine you, but there is a fetishization of law as progress. And I think it's a problem because we are looking at making equality by putting in measures where we are protecting or giving some rights to some people that therefore is deemed to be equality for everybody, which I think is very problematic because we only giving an inclusion to those that fit within our system, and we just widen the boundaries slightly and then frame it as in like, well, you got marriage now, so what's the problem, right? And I think that in itself is quite problematic because it's shifting the kind of how do we look at what's the problem to individualist rights-based approaches where it's you just should be able to get access to certain choices without actually thinking about systemic violences underneath. And I think when we then also create these utopias and dystopias by focusing on where is the legislation different, what we actually also are doing is changing how people experience homophobia, transphobia in different places. For example, because we're talking about Belgium, the UK, France as like exceptionally good at protecting LGBT rights, being a victim of homophobia or transphobic violence or biphobia, any of the violences that you're a victim of, becomes as actually not accepted. It shouldn't be there, right? So what has been done is like actually the problem is being individualized around the perpetrator, or it's like kind of taking away from any systemic problem. And then in other places, the dystopias, we're doing the exact opposite, right? We're then making it so big and so systemic that we're also not seeing where there are where change is happening or where things are changing, which I think is very problematic, because what it in essence does, and this is where neoliberalism and the whole structure of where we currently live under been so successful at, is shifting the analysis away from the system to individuals. And what we're now trying to do is trying to fix individuals so that we don't have to change the system. And I think that is, in the last kind of history, the biggest problem, because it creates, I think, yeah, I think it has lulled us in I've said this quite a couple of times this week, but it lulled us, I think, in this false sense belief of progress, that we've fallen asleep almost as into kind of where we are, like, oh yeah, everything's great, where now suddenly we're waking up in almost a nightmare, where then people are saying, why the fuck am I still protesting this shit that I thought I had won already? And I think it's a real thing, and it's coming because we're so looking for tokens of progress. Maybe because we're desperate for progress, right? Because we've been doing this for a very long time. We want to move on, but there's a tokenistic approach coming because the system has been hidden from our analysis. And I think we have been made to do that on purpose by how we have been allowed to change EU legislation, by how we have been allowed to change some of these things. That the radical roots of the system have been pushed out through the history. And I think what you said about dependencies, I think is really, really important. I think I'll just leave it there, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Again, something very interesting, very thought-provoking. Sorry, Peter, I'm afraid I would agree on the whole fetishization of the law thing, and getting the legislation, and then it's all done. And we're fine and happy. Of course, culture takes an awful long time to change, and systems take such a long time to change, and they bite back. And that's the unfortunate thing. But anyway, I'm not here to be making speeches. Perhaps Tony, if you would go next.
Yes, thank you so much, Marianne. Apologies for joining late. In a sense, I think both Roberta and Kun have said what I would perhaps usually say. So I think perhaps I maybe speak to practices that also have to do with the EU externally and the UK externally. So sort of piggybacking off of what's been said, I think, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think it is true that the law, at least in the context of the EU, has had a sort of push, particularly among some member states, or at least groups within member states have been able to leverage EU law to get some sort of advancements for themselves. Nevertheless, I do agree that we shouldn't necessarily confuse some of these advancements with sort of progressive understandings of what gender is. And it's from there that I'm coming, this sort of the push more towards this idea of women's rights, which I think is a good in of itself, and we certainly wouldn't want the European Union to stop doing that. But I think that there's also a question of, who counts in the context of these different understandings of gender, and at what cost should we accept these different understandings of gender. And for that, I think it's perhaps useful to look both externally, but also perhaps looking at the relationship between the external and the internal. So as has already been noted, the EU tries to project itself as this sort of gender equal polity, that it's done such a good job internally that, externally, to those other places that don't know so much about whether you call it women's rights, whether you call it gender equality, that there's something good to do. And not just that there's something good to do, that there's something unique about the way that the EU does things that is somewhat better. And we know that this is not necessarily the case, because if anything if history has shown us, it's that both European Union member states, as well as the institutions themselves, they do what it is that they feel is in their interest, even if they don't articulate it as such, or we choose not to see it as such. And so when we look at the EU's external relations, for example, it has consistently, particularly within development policies, promoted this idea of gender equality. It has given money to programs around gender equality. And indeed, a lot of organizations have benefited from that sort of disbursement of funding. But often, this is very contingent, again, on this EU's narrow understanding. So some of the questions that I tend to ask, for example, is, okay, so the EU gives money to a program that says it wants to focus on gender equality. But to what extent does the EU's general sort of foreign policy approach or development policy approach specifically actually engender the sort of gender equality that we might take for granted within Europe and of itself? So there, we already see a contestation. On the one hand, the EU says it promotes an understanding of gender equality, primarily, as Roberta has described, through women's rights. But some of the EU's policies in of themselves, so the structure of the EU's identity, the way in which it projects that, undermine some of those aims that it seeks to promote. Partly because of the way that it understands what gender is, but also because the EU, I think, has failed to internalize the fact that it itself is quite gendered. Because the narrative has always been, we're the good ones, we're the ethically good ones, which, to my mind, is a bastardization of what normative power Europe is or is supposed to do. But nevertheless, this is how I think it's very much been internalized within the European Union. So we have these policies that actually undermine even the possibilities of the narrow definition that the EU has accepted for itself. But when we, for example, apply a lens, say a feminist lens, to trying to then understand, how can we unpick gender then in what it is that the EU is doing? The thing that becomes very obvious is, of course, that we cannot ignore structure, that we cannot ignore the ways in which different forms of oppression overlap with each other and are functioning at the exact same time to undermine both the narrow conceptions of gender equality, but also to hide the deeply hierarchical ways in which the European Union functions. So I want to use an example that I think applies to both the UK and the EU. Of course, 7 years ago, I wouldn't make this distinction, but here we are. And I sort of think in terms of migration, for example. Currently, when the EU is thinking about migration, it employs this discourse, this sort of human rights discourse, and says it is enacting the policies it's enacting because it wants to protect people from people smugglers. This is a straightforward narrative that I think anybody on the street can easily accept. I mean, who would not want to protect people from people smugglers? So what happens when you apply gender lens? One is the fact that historically, the EU's migration policies, as the UK's as well, has been made as if it's mostly men that are migrating. And to a large extent, that hasn't been adapted, despite the fact that the EU has had this 70 years of a sort of gender equality framework that has evolved. Secondly, when you again sort of zoom out and you sort of look at those structures, you see that actually, in the context of enacting its migration policies, the EU kind of adopts the position of what in feminist work has been called the manly state, right? So it sort of embodies this sort of particularly hegemonic hierarchical masculinity vis-a-vis those people who are migrating, and particularly those people who are migrating irregularly, and justifies that on a range of bases, more recently around geopolitical reasons. And when we begin to see that, then some of the EU's policies will become very unsurprising. So for example, deals with both Turkey as well as Libya, we know has had a significant impact on women and other marginalized communities in those countries. Even when the EU talks about promoting human rights, in this particular arena, it's willing to behave differently. Similarly, for those people who've been paying attention, we can make the same claims when we look at the United Kingdom vis-a-vis the deal that it's done with Rwanda. So on the one hand, the UK is comfortable going to the UN to talk about the human rights gaps in Rwanda, but then says, well, the migrants, whether they're women or men, are okay to be sent over there for reasons that it justifies. And then finally, and I think this continues to be a really horrendous issue, not the least because of some of the previous discussion that we've been having. In the UK, it is still the case that migrant women often have very limited access to the facilities that can support them with respect to both sexual and other gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence. So in this architecture, these women are not worthy of being considered within both the legal as well as the sort of societal framework as those who should be in recipient of the sort of norms that we've sort of attached to gender and gender equality. And so to sort of conclude, I wouldn't argue that laws are not good. I mean, I think if anything has been shown to us from what's happened in the United States this week, and again, not just with Roe v. Wade, but also what's happened in the UK this week with respect to the variety of bills, is that laws do matter. And in a sense, that's the thing that gets us up to want to do differently. But it doesn't start with the law, and it doesn't end with the law. And if anything, one thing that sort of gender and sexuality studies teaches us is that we definitely, and this, my last word of this, a plea to everyone, that it's really important that, we move beyond the binary, that in our quest to try to make ourselves understood on issues around gender, I think perhaps we've also been complicit in accepting this ways of talking about gender, of accepting the idea of sex-based rights, which do not exist in this country and indeed in most other countries. And so in that sense, language also matters. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Yes, very powerful statement. Language does matter so much, and I've been very interested because here in Ireland we're under influences that are flowing in, but also within our own communities. This idea of sex-based rights being primary now is growing and growing, and that's very, very problematic and something I think we really need to think about. Perhaps then we should move on to Peter.
So thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks very much for putting on this event. I'm really happy to be here. Don't worry, I'm not going to man the battalions for law. I think law does have a role in a process. Obviously, law can obviously also play a kind of destructive role there as well. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the conversations that we're having in the United Kingdom. With this government, there is so much to choose from. And I think anyone who sort of thinks, well, it's a conversation solely about gender identity is perhaps not keeping the eye on the ball, particularly when we're thinking more generally about gender and sexuality as well. There are many things we can talk about. I'm going to be quite boring for this 5 minutes and just kind of pick out some observations that I have, and perhaps other people in the panel may or may not agree with them, just about the conversations that we specifically being had around issues of gender identity, gender expression, and kind of the nature of that conversation and potentially issues that I think potentially are somewhat problematic. So what are we proposing in terms of reform? So many people who are attending today might be aware that a lot of the conversation about trans, non-binary, gender diverse rights that we have in the UK spring out of proposed legislative reforms, right? So that in some ways was seen as being the catalyst for those conversations, those discussions, those debates. The first question, however, I find problematic within this conversation, this public and political conversation is, well, what's actually being reformed? Because if you were to read the newspapers, if you were to watch the BBC, if you were to listen to the radio, you think a whole range of reforms were happening and that a whole range of proposed legislative changes were being proposed that simply aren't the case. And so I think one of the real problems about the debate that we're having, or the conversations that we're having in a legislative context in the UK, is that people are being asked to come on either political programs or more general programs to discuss the merits of reforms that nobody is proposing. And so we often hear people saying, well, you know, trans advocates, LGBT rights organizations, the LGBT, you know, comma Inc. in the UK, which has taken over all of, you know, taken out of all of queer spaces, they just won't defend particular reforms. They want government to pass them, but they won't defend them. And that's, in my opinion, not true. What people are saying is, I'm not going to come on and have a hypothetical conversation on Newsnight about a reform that, irrespective of whether or not I agree, nobody is proposing and actually is a red herring. It's a conversation that people. So that's the first, I think. What are we actually talking about? Secondly, what are people advocating? This is another issue I think that's really important. So many of the people attending here may be aware that there is a real conversation about whether or not the United Kingdom, and then more specifically Scotland, because it has a proposed bill, should adopt a model of self-determination for a process by which people can obtain legal gender recognition. So the process by which someone formally legally changes their gender. And the question is, well, whether or not there should be self-determination. And there are many people who are opposing self-determination. There are, at least all consultations suggest, more people who are in favor. The conversation, however, can be somewhat frustrating, right? Because if you listen to the political conversations in Parliament, or you listen to the public conversations that we're having and the opposition to self-determination, it is very frequently not opposition to self-determination. It is opposition to the very right of individuals to be able to obtain legal gender recognition. So under the guise of opposition to proposing the Gender Recognition Act, we are seeing, reforming the Gender Recognition Act, we are seeing opposition to the Gender Recognition Act. And that, I think, is another point of frustration, because I think people should be allowed to discuss whether or not we should have self-ID. I'm one of those academics who does think we have to have difficult conversations, but I don't think it's productive to come on and have a conversation about reforming an act when actually that conversation is about repealing that act. And in a context where we're not allowed to repeal that act, right? We can't not have legal gender recognition in the UK because we were the country that our failure to establish legal gender recognition until the start of the 20th century meant that the European Court of Human Rights had to establish this more general right to legal gender recognition. I think there are a couple of things when we think about the idea of free speech, right? And so the first thing I would say is debates about gender identity and gender expression in the UK, and particularly, and I'm going to be a boring lawyer here, about the legal reforms, very often are completely devoid of any substantive conversation about what those reforms would require, right? The debate has descended into a situation where today we have somebody coming on saying, I don't support the reforms of the Gender Recognition Act, to which somebody responds, well, why do you oppose the reforms to the Gender Recognition Act? And their response is, oh, well, I can't even talk about that. And it's like, well, we're giving you this platform to talk about it. Please explain your substantive disagreement with these reforms. Oh, I'd love to tell you, but I can't because I'm being deplatformed. I'm being deplatformed on the BBC, on the Times, on the Telegraph, on Channel 4, all of these places I'm being deplatformed, and I'm coming on to talk about how I'm being deplatformed. And I know that sounds rather facetious, but there is a point there, which is that actually we don't often see the kind of meritorious, actually substantive arguments against the against reforms or against trans rights, right? There's this assumption that these very good arguments exist in the ether, but no one's allowed to talk about them because of wokeism gone crazy. But actually, we don't often see those substantive reforms being presented. And that's what I would like to see a little bit more. I actually, as I say, am someone who does believe that we have to have difficult and challenging conversations about reform. Good people in academia absolutely disagree with that, right? But I think we do. But I think it is a three-way step. If you're proposing a reform, you have to be able to discuss it, will it, and willing to debate it. But if you're going to criticize a reform, freedom of speech works both ways. And to criticize opposition to the extension of the rights of trans and non-binary people in the UK is not to stifle debate. It is to engage in the debate and to say, you have a substantive opposition to this reform. Well, I have a substantive critique of your opposition, which I don't believe is grounded in the reality of the legislative process. And I don't believe is grounded in the social science research which exists. And I'm not stopping you from talking, but I am critiquing your critique of that reform. And I do think there are some points of opposition which do go beyond the pale, which are not necessary, you know, in a democratic society, which go beyond what we would consider the limits of Article 10 free speech, and which do fall into hate speech. And it is not people crying or people unwilling to have a debate to say, I actually don't believe in the European context where we have all of this history of the consequences of hate speech that we should allow this to happen. Yes, we have to have robust debate, but some things do go on the pale. And I had a couple of things to say, but I've spoken for too long. I do think the final thing I'll say is, particularly in the UK, how we have instrumentalized an interesting and supposed oppositionality of gender identity rights and sexual orientation rights, I think is really interesting, right? The idea that trans rights are being seen as taking up the space of advocacy. And so there's, you know, you can't be a cis gay man anymore. This idea of, you know, which the BBC seems to be obsessed with cis lesbians being forced to have sexual intercourse with trans women and trans feminine individuals. Something I have, you know, worked in this area for 10 years and never have come across. This idea that we can't have an inclusive conversion therapy legislation because actually it's stealth conversion therapy of confused young gay men and lesbians by the back door. I was a long time ago now, you know, a young gay man, and what I needed was greater visibility, greater support, greater capacity to be able to talk. What I didn't need was the rights of my trans peers being limited. So anyway, listen, looking forward to having a conversation and defending the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And yes, defended the law quite well there. And I would agree, this is a very difficult area at the moment because, of course, you're right, the opposition isn't really coming up with any oppositional points. It's all about, well, I can't talk because I'm going to be cancel cultured or whatever. You know, I think we need to somehow move beyond that, to get back on track to talking about what is necessary, what reforms, what laws, what legislation, what cultural shifts, etc., etc. But this whole morass that we seem to have found ourselves in, and I think deliberately, and it was deliberately created, is something that needs to be dealt with. But we shall talk about that anon, because we have our final speaker, Fiachra, who is now going to take the floor, so to speak.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for inviting me to participate today. It's been really thought-provoking, even as I've been listening to all the speakers. And this morning, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about the context of Ireland at the edge of Europe in lots of ways. We, as a post-colonial republic and 6 counties still in a space of peace, but in a liminal space. I often look to kind of Deborah Lupton's notion of risk and the risky body, and the post-colonial countries often having to assert a masculinity having been penetrated by another country, that and I think of Ireland as a kind of an adolescent nation state in many ways, that is trying to come to terms with what does Irishness look like in the 21st century. And with that then becomes kind of trying to be progressive, but also struggling to understand what it is to be in the world. And like when I was thinking this morning about this in the context of like Ireland looking to our neighbours on the west, to the States as someone to be the leaders, and then looking to the east, to Europe, and not getting things clear from those perspectives. And so one of the things when I was thinking about is that we had a referendum to allow same-sex marriage. And at the time, there was a lot of debate about whether we needed to have a referendum, to have it written into our written constitution to protect. And there was arguments that, and there has been continued arguments about and debates around the impact of having to have a referendum on LGBT plus people, because it was quite divisive. But because of what's happened in the States, there's a part to me very much welcomes the fact that it would now take a referendum to withdraw another referendum to withdraw the rights for same-sex marriage. What we also have in our written constitution is a placing of women in a domestic position, which we need to unravel. And this is where I'm saying we have the valorizing of rights and then the suppression of rights embedded in a constitution. And so when Deborah Lupton talks about risk, she talks about the risky body and the risky bodies needing, the state needs to control and protect itself from that. And so LGBT plus people, women, are seen as risky because they cannot protect their bodies. They don't have bodily integrity. And so the state is still grappling, and the Irish state is still grappling with that. And hand in hand with Lupton's notion, I also look at Tanya Niverhala's writing in relation to the recognizable body and how the law recognizes certain bodies and doesn't recognize others. And I think the law definitely sees the world in binaries. In the Irish context, the legislature has examined and reviewed how we should see bodies, how we should recognize genders, and has decided that binary identities have to be maintained, man and woman. We have self-determined gender recognition, so people can choose. Welcome back, and we can, so people can self-determine their gender. Where we're at in Ireland at the moment is the changes that happened in 2015 happened, and it was a space of joy. It very much goes back to the earlier discussion about the sense that once the law changes, everything is done. We move on now to something else, and and not in the context of wider systemic structural issues that people have talked about. So, for instance, research has shown in 2019, large surveys, that the experience of gender and sexual minority children in schools is exactly the same as 30 years ago, that they are experiencing attacks, they feel vulnerable, they feel unsafe, the same for research with adults. People, I'm a 43-year-old gay man. I'd say I've held my partner's hand in public about 5 times. I still don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. This is after marriage equality, gender recognition. So the sense that the law creates change. Sometimes social and culture takes a lot longer to catch up, but sometimes the law doesn't reflect the lived experiences of people in communities too. How we have expansive ways of managing and understanding how families are. And so we in Ireland don't have legislation that recognises expansive ways of being a family, of creating families, of being family and doing family. But yet we know that that's happening in our society. So we are not responding legislatively fast enough. And I think that's the core of our issue. The core of our issues is that we're trying to squeeze everything into a legislative framework all of the time. And I think what we're failing to see is how the issues that arise for women, the issues that arise for LGBT, sexual and gender minority people in Ireland, take place in a context where there is a housing crisis, where there is a underdeveloped welfare state, where there is a cost of living crisis, where there is problems where, when I talk about our Irish identity, when we talk about migration, we have a direct provision process for asylum seekers and refugees that has been magically transformed in response to Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers, but continues to let people who have fled other war zones to live in direct provision with €19 a week to live on, for 8, 9, 10 years. So our identity is a white Irish male identity that is protected and fails, and I should also say settled rather than nomadic, because our own Indigenous ethnic minority group are othered along with other Roma and traveling people. And that we are trying to unravel that, and it is a challenge. And the only way I think that we can try to unravel those issues is through solidarity. Because one of the things that I worry is about the splintering of people. So, and the splintering, so trans issues not being something that LGBT or other people, that women's issues are not of concern to gay men, that gender equality, that men don't have a role in that it's about, solidarity is the only way that we can confront systemic patriarchy and misogyny. And I'm going to stop there, Mary, because I've gone on too long.
Thank you very much, Fiachra. I like your image of Ireland, post-colonial Ireland, as a sort of a teenager who so desperately wants to be hip and cool and down with the kids, the hip and cool kids in the EU, but actually, has been brought up within a very misogynistic, faith-based, binary, straight, heteronormative system, and doesn't know quite how to get rid of that, and doesn't know if they want to get rid of it either. But thank you all for those conversations. And before I go to the questions, perhaps I could use my position as chair to sort of draw a few links there, and just listening to you all talk about the EU, the UK and Ireland in terms of gendered and sexual politics, that I suppose in many ways, because my own area of research is within Ireland and looking in many ways towards Europe as a beacon for good in terms of, say, feminist activism and gender politics from the time we joined the EU in the 70s. Ireland was forced to bring our gender equality norms in line with the EU norms, and it seemed to deliver something that was good. So, you know, there was that. And I think that really goes back to what you were saying, Roberta, you know, that within these founding treaties, there is this suggestion of, you know, equal pay, equal work. But I really thought it is very important to understand that this was about access to the male-based labour market and was not specifically about any gendered positioning within society. So it was about women entering this patriarchal, male-based labour market, hierarchical capitalist labour market, and in which they have to operate then as gendered bodies. And how does that actually then equate with visions of equality? And the same with, I think, the EU's response to both LGBT rights, but also to migrant rights in recent years. I mean, yes, the LGBT celebrate, or the EU celebrates the fact that, you know, LGBT rights are codified in, you know, legislation and treaties and ideas and policies, and that East-West divide is so obvious that they're creating that East-West divide that you mentioned. You know, if you go beyond Austria into the former Soviet countries, well, aren't they a bit of a basket case? But they'll become like us in time, just give them time. You know, it is very much that hierarchical visioning of Western Europe as brilliant and fantastic, and, you know, a sort of utopian experience of equality, LGBT equality, women's equality, race equalities. But of course, we know this is not the truth at all. And it does, that normalization of certain ways of being and certain ways of not being makes it more difficult then, as you said, to challenge systems. So because it's about us getting it wrong, individuals getting it wrong, and not about the fact that the systems that brought those inequalities and in which those inequalities are firmly embedded, whether they give little bits of rights to certain groups or not, means that we're not transforming the system. We're painting nice colors over it so it appears nice and shiny and new and accepting. And, you know, we can all be a gender and queer equality together, and everybody's happy in this. But then if you look at what is happening on the borders, on our borders, with what we call the migrant crisis, well, whose crisis was it? It wasn't the EU's crisis. The EU could actually have created laws in which there was no crisis. It was a crisis for those people on those borders being treated in the way they were, particularly women. And doing those deals with Turkey and with Libya was not about protecting women and was not about protecting migrants. It was about protecting what we see as our nice utopian European culture from those people. And so when we other people like that, as the EU does, we create these systems, these hierarchical systems of who's in and who's out, inclusion and exclusion. And though we would condemn others for doing exactly the same thing, the EU does it itself. And you see that, as Fiachra said, in our response to the Ukrainian crisis, which has been laudable, and the welcoming in of Ukrainian refugees. But we continue to treat those who are not Ukrainian refugees as other, as somebody that need to be marginalized, locked away, in keeping with the way that we marginalized and locked away women and children for many, many decades of our post-colonial Irish state. And I think in responding to you, Peter, as well, laws matter, language matters. I think debates, yes, they do need to be had, but debates can't include debating whether people have a right to exist. You know, we had the gender self-ID debate here, and legislation was passed. And now there are those who are anti-trans who are saying, well, it was snuck in. There were certain people who were, you know, in bed with lobbyists who were in bed with the government, and it was done at, you know, at midnight on a certain day. Well, they don't say quite that, but this idea that a marginalized minority of people managed to sneak in legislation by their absolutely you know, how do they have this influence on legislators and it has been in place, and the sky has not fallen in. Lesbians have not been forced to have sex with anybody they don't want to have. These arguments that are being had about trans people are vicious and violent and are creating real harm. And I think we need to understand that while, yes, we should debate reform or repeal or whatever legislation is coming through, the way it's being framed in the media at the moment is actually dangerous. It's dangerous for people. And I suppose in many ways, responding to what all of you have said, it's tying all those threads together. There are anxieties. This is a moment or moments in time where, the EU has delivered a certain degree of equality or certain concepts and policies on equality. But where do we go from here? How do we resist backlashes? How do we resist those who refuse to engage with equality? How do we try and change the hierarchies, the structures, and the systems, not just the law, very important to change the law, but how do we move on from there? We've got the legislation in place. How do we move on from there? And I suppose that's the question I would throw to all of you. In one or two sentences, what do we do?
Just in terms of the EU law, and this is not a suggestion, but I think what is really interesting is actually implementation, right? So this is not to say the solution to the problems of law is more law. I do tend to believe that, kind of a Derek Bell idea of culture shift versus rule shift, that rule shifts can play a role in culture shifts, but that you need to focus on the culture shift. The only thing I would say is that there was some really interesting data points from the EU in the 2019, early 2020 period. There was two juxtapositions. I know because I was involved in one of the reports, which was, the first was the Eurobarometer, which basically showed slightly improving views across the European Union on issues of LGBTI rights. But the two ones which really stood out were a report that I did, which was about equality legislation. And it was really positive, right? It was really positive, showing that actually even where the EU hadn't legislated, there was still huge and quite unexpectedly high levels of legislative reform. The second was FRA's LGBTI survey from 2020, which showed equally high levels of discrimination. And one of the things that we discovered when we were doing a report was that there was just no case law. And so it's all very well and good for there to be these directives in existence, but two things. I think the EU, who I work with quite a lot, so I'm not complaining about them, but I think that they have to put more effort in terms of seeing those laws actually applied and implemented. And I've forgotten my second point, so I will leave it at there. But I think I'm not suggesting that implemented laws will create cultural change, but I think the problem is that we literally at the moment in some jurisdictions just have laws with no implementation to see whether or not they're actually having a practical application.
Can I piggyback on this? Because it's something I've been thinking about as well. And I think, and I don't like the language of backlash because it implies that we've got somewhere. And I may be a pessimist in many ways, but I'm not quite sure that we actually have made the progress we think we have made. I think the change in attitudes is a change in people telling us what they think. And I think there's a change in how attitudes and how feelings are actually expressed in society based upon what is deemed acceptable to demonstrate to. And I think all of our the surveys that we're running and the questions we're asking are asking the wrong questions to really understand what is the real view of people. Because the way in which prejudice is expressed has changed. I don't think the prejudice has left us. And I think that is a really big impression. And there's a really important distinction, because I think all what we're seeing now is because of the massive shift to the right that we are experiencing across the world, now expressing prejudice is allowed again. Mm-hmm. And that is really what is happening rather than anything else. So what we're seeing is really a shift of power in who is allowed to speak and what is allowed to be said, rather than actually change progress. I don't like the idea of progress. And that's also why I don't like these ideas where we're kind of creating hierarchies of how I want to ditch the teenager analogy, but for me, it kind of really doesn't sit well with me, because I think it's implying the idea of progress and getting somewhere be the parent? Is there anybody then educating? Is it, I mean, that already to me becomes, it almost shows that there is someone who has all the answers, and I think it's definitely not the case. But I think for me, having that realization that actually like really questioning the idea of progress, so we have a better realistic understanding where we are, might arm us better to do the fight in a different way and be more vigilant. And I think the interesting point of what Peter was saying is about the non-debate, right? Mm. It's a real smart tactic because they're winning debates by not having the debate. True. Because they are in the position of power, they don't have to debate. If they can just give the illusion of there is a reason, then done, they win. And then the gaslighting and making sure they become the victim in all of it. And then your golden seal that we are stuck. And I think we need to find strategies to go around these things. Don't have answers. I'm not very good at giving answers, but I think I like to think that my pessimistic views might inspire others to give some answers.
Roberta or Tony or Fiona?
Yeah, I just Tony, you go. Do you want to go, or can I go? Okay,
you can go.
Okay, I'll just jump in, and I'd like to challenge the idea of the fact that we're in a crisis now. Because to think about this as being in a crisis, it depends on whose experience are we actually focusing on as part of that understanding of crisis. Akugo Majulu and Leah Bassel wrote a really fantastic piece on the annual review of the Journal of Common Market Studies a couple of years back, looking exactly at this particular issue, right? And who's experiencing crisis when and where. And Black and minority ethnic women are constantly in a state of crisis. So we really need to think about who the laws are for, who are they implemented for. I agree with Peter about the implementation side, and that is one of the huge gaps. But also we need to kind of snap out of thinking about whose crisis it is that we're really focusing on in our experience and our understanding of this process. And last but not least, also to check our biases in when we think about the way that the EU projects abroad. And if we, Mary, you mentioned the refugee crisis, well, not the refugee crisis, the influx of refugees from Ukraine at the moment. And I think we need to take a step back and think about the way the governments have been framing the discussions about refugees, and especially in relations to migrants from Ukraine in the context of this latest, if you wish, crisis. And one of the things that was not focused on for the longest time are issues around safeguarding, because the whole gender lens was not applied when thinking about refugees. So thinking about the UK, when government opened it up, in inverted commas, opened up the border, welcoming families to welcome refugees from Ukraine. There was little or no discussions about the fact that many of those refugees are single young women traveling alone, and the impact that has in terms of their safeguarding and well-being. All of those kind of things really highlight how gender permeates all the decisions that we're making. Who is allowed to travel and who's allowed to be a refugee as well, to link back to the point that Tony made about the government's approach to refugees in relation to Rwanda. So those are the kind of issues that we really need to always have in mind. I'm not going to be a pessimist because pessimism deactivates. So, we need to remain focused. We need to remain activated and engaged. We need to hold governments to account. And we cannot forget that the reason why the European Union included Article 119, it wasn't because the founding fathers, and I'm using the term really purposefully here, were great feminists. They weren't. They only included it to safeguard the interests of the newly established common market. And those were economic interests that related to the states. And therefore, all the biases that those men had in the development of that particular framework remain there today. And so that's the kind of challenge for all of us doing work in these areas. How do you actually move beyond those kind of biases that are embedded within the DNA or the framework of those provisions?
Thank you very much. And actually, if I could come in, I have a question from Jonathan. because believe it or not, we are flying towards the end of the session. I have a question about the discipline of European studies and its stake in confronting issues of misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia, particularly for Cohen and Roberta, given that they're at CES, but interested in the rest of the panel's views. How serious is it taken? How proactive is the scholarly community in a moment that calls for renewed and urgent activist scholarship? And then I have a few other questions from the attendees. So Tony, perhaps, or Roberta and Cohen, or whoever would like to go.
Well, I'm not at CES, so I know that there've been some fracas around gender and gendered outcomes, but I mean, I can spend the entire day talking about what it means for our field and our discipline. I mean, my experience probably comes from perspective of being a former journal editor. We don't have parity, right? And I think, you know, as a start, that should be something that we aspire to. And it often fascinates me that when I go to conferences and you sort of see a lot of women represented, you kind of assume that, yes, we are making that progress, you know, go back to Cohen's point. And then when you sort of see the context of article submissions, when you look at the context of what types of contracts people are on, when you look at the context of what provisions are there for childcare or research support, who's championed within institutions, what priorities professional associations have, not IACES or UACES, by the way. But you realize this sort of endemic inequality that is baked into the system that continues to undermine the possibilities of parity. And parity isn't even like, it's not even up to that narrow definition of gender equality that we were talking about, you know. But nevertheless, it really, at least from my perspective, it does ask us to confront, you know, the structures within which we exist. Unfortunately, you know, the field is not independent of a lot of other things, right? So if I repeat again, it's about the sort of contracts we're on. So as much as, say, UACES or IACES might want to do something, they cannot provide employment for as much people as we wish had employment. But they do have a role. Protest, what seems to be rampant now in the UK, and I think especially pertinent for EU studies, which is this both overt and covert attacks on the arts and humanities, and often that leaks into the social sciences. And the way that these attacks are undertaken, and often the ways in which they're framed, they're very gendered, right? So this idea that, you know, science and tech is going to save us, what's the point of the arts and humanities? And when you look at the sort of characteristics that are then ascribed to those subjects, you realize you know, how far this sort of binary thinking has gone, and the ways in which it affects us in the everyday. But anyway, as I said, there's a lot to say about it, and I really hope that we do pick up this thread in other workshops, seminars, webinars, conferences. But I'll leave it there.
And Cohen or Roberta, would you like to quickly comment on that, as you're there?
In terms of the discipline, I think there is a lot that can be done, especially in relation to how we present the discipline and the canon. And there's actually work that we're doing as part of UACES really in understanding how the canon is biased. But also there is work that we can do as colleagues to not assume authority and expertise. And I'm happy to draw on an experience I had yesterday to go back to what Tony was saying. And this is only one of the panels where things kind of were not particularly great. When male panel chairs of panels actually seek to undermine the authority of female speakers, assuming that they have no confidence when technology is not working. So, there are many ways that we as scholars, as academics and colleagues, we can mentor, but also we should not assume that kind of paternalist, benevolent sexism that all women or minoritized groups at conferences need the mentoring.
I think I just want to add as well, like often it's up to us, those who are marginalized, to do the work to be seen and to be heard, whilst then nobody else needs to actually step in to take that, to come and listen. Like I used to co-chair the Gender Sexuality Research Network, and like it's a bubble, which is nice for us because we need those spaces, but someone needs to come and listen to us to see what we have to say, because we have pushed the field in many ways, but then 10 years, 20 years later, some white male straight men will come and say, oh, look what I just discovered, as it's something new thing. And I think there is also, we have to do a lot, but also I think it's the discipline that needs to also be willing to actually go and search for something that they don't usually see.
And cite the people who have done the work before, and not assume that this work has not been done just because you haven't discovered it and it doesn't appear in the mainstream journals, right? So, and actually, I'd really like to take this opportunity, because Tony's here, to say thank you for the work that she and Richard have done to really push the boundaries of how we understand EU studies, right? Because journal editors, textbook authors, textbook editors, professional associations really have an important role to play in the way that we understand and promote different interests within the discipline.
Thank you very much for that, and welcome to the world of being a gender historian as well. Pushing it, and then somebody, a straight white man, will come along and say, oh, look, this is very interesting now. Let's start this new type of history and talk about these subjects. And there's 40 years of scholarship already there, but ignore that. Fiachra or Peter, you want to say anything?
I just to say that I think something that Peter said earlier and Cohen said about sometimes we can't have solutions. So having the difficult conversations, kind of asking questions constantly, and I suppose I think we have to structure discussion as well, in a way that allows for difficult conversations to be had, but in a respectful way. And I can give an example where we had a conference recently in UCC where I work, and we were it was about lesbian women, and we were confronted really with a lot of negative attacks around, because we had a trans woman as a keynote speaker. And it didn't allow for the discussion, having us set up the conference in a way that allowed for multiple, that we wanted all voices to be heard in a respectful, safer way. And I think so allowing us to kind of ask questions and not have solutions is really important, because I think questioning the status quo is really important, and I think in relation to activist spaces, I really echo that. I think I'm involved in the Gay Project, which is a charity here in Cork, and we had a queer hedge school during COVID, and what was really, a lot of activists that came and spoke there talked about how us academics came in, swooped in on the work that they were doing and came up with a theory around it. And so I think it's very important that we recognize and valorize activism, and see it as offering something to the academy and to academic studies, rather than us colonizing the activist movements.
Thank you. And just very quickly on the few comments we've had from Paul O'Dwyer, he mentioned that the importance of individual stories, and I think we have seen that in that we are telling individual stories, or some have come out here. And a question about Tina Beattie's travails on Twitter. I'm afraid I don't know that. Do any of you know of that? Seems very reasonable, but gets a lot of obnoxious stuff thrown at her. No. Okay, one question from Vivian. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I wonder if you could say something about the EU starting to talk seriously about enlargement again, and the challenges it creates for EU's pink rainbow washing.
Well, I guess that's a question posed to me, given that it's my field of expertise. I mean, I think the EU is talking about enlargement again. It probably is good for the EU and for the countries who've been put on hold. But I'm very skeptical of the EU's intentions with LGBT rights and gender rights and women's rights in this process. I think it's going to, a lot of its EU identity around LGBT rights and around Gender Equality Act and all that stuff is created through this process of boundary creation, because enlargement is in essence a process of boundary creation and really defining who belongs, who doesn't. And LGBT rights is now at the core. And I think it's quite reflective, but also we need to be realizing that a lot of the countries, like Serbia, for example, is a semi-authoritarian regime who have learned how to play the game based upon the experiences from Eastern Europe. They are enmeshed in anti-gender movements full everywhere, but they know exactly how to talk the talk. And maybe I should just plug my book, which is coming out in December and January, or January, which is exactly dealing with this, and it will reflect on how Vucic is, for example, talking at the fourth demographic summit in Budapest, and saying how he knows he needs to speak certain words so that a sexual Marxist will recognize him as being good, whilst actually doing all the work that needs to be done to protect the demographic, whatever bullshit he was talking about. So I'm not a big fan of how EU is doing these things, because I don't think it's about people, it's about EU. And that's where my problem lies. The people are not present in any of these stories. And for as long as people are not present, there is a problem.
Yes, very much so. If it doesn't center in on the people, and it is the state, again, it's the system, protecting the system, protecting the power brokers. Another question just came in. Catherine says, thank you for one of the most genuinely thought-provoking seminars. You've all spoken so passionately, articulately, and critically. It's not my area of expertise, and it's refreshing to attend and learn. And Paul says, an excellent seminar. So I think we're coming up to the hour and a half. Peter, you want to say something just before we?
Well, no, if we're finishing up, I was going to piggyback onto that, but
oh yeah, go ahead. We've got a minute or two.
Well, it's just to sort of say, I think it would be somewhat worrying if the EU in the next sort of 5 years, particularly within the area of queer rights, was to sort of turn their focus externally. If 14 years later, the EU still can't pass a very moderate equality directive extending protections for sexual orientation beyond the framework directive, and if we're still stuck with gender reassignment, a very nebulous and potentially somewhat limited protected characteristic being the only internal protection we have for trans individuals, my feeling would be that I think that if the EU was to focus on LGBTI issues, they might look at their own house in terms of, first of all, the actual implementation. So the stuff we talked about today, the culture shift, making people's lives better, and then solidifying the actual legislative framework. I think that potentially that could have a better impact in the longer term for the EU.
Absolutely, get your own house in order first before moving on from there. And it's very much, at a local level, I find the gender washing at, International Women's Day, and then the pink washing during Pride of all the globalists and the big tech companies. And then you see their policies and you see the harms that are being done in terms of misogyny and homophobia and transphobia through technology, through social media. And but it's all fine if we have, a big rainbow flag outside their front door during Pride Month. And maybe that's like yourself, Cohen, the cynic in me, who is always looking for reasons not to be hopeful. But I do think perhaps in this discussion, in summing it up, I think we continue to be very aware, and this is what gives me the hope that moves me beyond, cynicism and pessimism, is that we continue to be aware. We continue to fight those fights. We continue to do it within our disciplines, within our organizations that represent those disciplines, within activism and within academia. And we have to continue doing that. And it does give me hope. And perhaps the one thing that does really give me hope is when I see the impact we have on students and the student body and the discussions that they are having, because of course they are the future lawyers, the future legislators, the future activists. And they are ready and open and willing to have those discussions. And I think they're also the future politicians in the EU. So I think we have to continue to have these discussions and to talk about, I know you said you didn't particularly like the concept of the backlash, but being a kind of old school feminist, I see backlash all the time, but unfortunately backlashes are happening almost simultaneously with any progression we're having these days. And for me, the concept of systemic change is still very much what needs to be campaigned for, what needs to be fought for, and is still a little bit out of reach. But I want to thank you all very much, Fiachra, Tony, Peter, Cohen, Roberta, and thank you, Jonathan, for organising this, and Emily, Emma, and Melanie, and all your team. It's been a fascinating discussion. All the comments coming in on the Q&A are saying it's been a fascinating discussion.